Murder at the Liberty Ballroom.
Really? You sure you want me to tell this story? I mean, I wasn't even actually there. No, I don't care for any more coffee, honey. Thank you. And I'll be honest, when I met Frank Batella, I liked him. I mean, everybody liked him. He was a really likable guy. But I wasn't sure I really believed him. I'd read about the murders, of course, everybody had. But how much of anything we read or hear in the media today can we even trust? But, okay, I'll tell it. But I'm going from the time or the times that Frank told the story around my Aunt Betty's Sunday dinner table. Every time she had a new guest, every time, she'd ask Frank to come over and to tell that story again. And it just seems like he never got tired of repeating it. But the details, seems like they got a little more elaborate every time I heard them. The newspaper referred to it as Murder at the Liberty Ballroom. And my friend Dennis Smurl, you know Dennis? He actually wrote a book about it. He swears this is the absolute truth. I don't know. You be the judge of that. Well, Frank said he was early for his appointment, so he decided to snoop around the old building while he waited. And in that part of Kansas, that's the far southeast corner of the state. It's just dotted with small towns like the one he was in. Some are hanging on by a thread, and others, I think, they're surviving on cattle and the land itself. But all of them have buildings like the one in front of him. They were constructed back during the Great Depression. And the Liberty Ballroom, as I understand it, it was a sturdy, round-roofed building that needed a fresh coat of paint. Well, like most of its contemporaries, Frank said it had the stubborn look of a survivor. Anyway, having seen all there was to see out front, he moved on to the rear of the property when he heard a car. So he followed the broken sidewalk back to the parking lot, where he said a grimy red Taurus sedan was coming to a stop close to the entrance. And then he said the sun bounced off the concrete. It was so hot that day, the sun was it nearly blinded him. So he squinted to get a better look at a big guy in overalls, maybe in his 60s, who got out of the Taurus and squinted back at him. The man yelled out, "You Battelle?" And of course Frank said he was, and the guy introduced himself as Tony Regaro. He said something about the sheriff told him that he would find Frank there. So Frank accepted the man's handshake, and he explained that he just needed to get inside the building for a look around. Well, Tony was searching through a ring of keys, and then he finally found what he was looking for, and he was opening the door, and Frank said that he really appreciated Tony coming to let him in. "Well," Tony replied, "it's kind of slow at the store anyway. I'll be glad to show you around." But Frank interrupted, and he said, I'd really rather you didn't. Tony wasn't too happy about that. And Tony explained that he was responsible for the place. But again, Frank cut him off. And then he asked if the sheriff had told Tony what it was Frank did for a living and why he was there. And that's when Tony sort of nodded and he said, "Yeah, you're some kind of a psychic, something like that." Well, Frank winced at the word psychic. Oh, did he hate that word. "I get impressions, Tony," he said. "Usually they're very faint ones, and distractions, they weaken them even more." Even at that, he wasn't sure Tony was getting the point. So he just told him right out, "I have to be alone when I work, Tony. It's the only way I can do this." Well, it was obvious that Tony wasn't thrilled, but he did finally relent, and he told Frank just to lock up when he was through. And he started to leave, but then on an impulse he turned around and he invited Frank to join him and his wife for dinner at their place that evening. "Just having spaghetti," he said, "but it's a whole lot better than what they've got over there at the diner." Well, Frank's first impulse was to decline the offer. But then he said it dawned on him that Tony might be a valuable source of information, that he probably knew the woman who was murdered. "Audrey Hilliard," Frank said. "Did you know her?" Tony's face flushed, but just for a moment, and not much. "Yeah, years ago, we were just high school kids, but yeah, I knew Audrey back then." Now, there was something in the tone of the custodian's voice that prompted Frank to say, "Girlfriend?" And then the flush grew deeper as this man, he shook his head from side to side. He was so embarrassed, and he said, "Me? Fat Tony?" Look, Audrey had her choice of the guys, but we were a team on this here dance floor. My mom danced, and Dad was pretty good, too. It sort of runs in the family. So Audrey and me, yeah, we won most of the dance contests, but when the music stopped, she never even knew I was alive.
Damn shame. She comes back after all this time and gets herself murdered. And in this building where we all had such good times.
Frank had the impression that there was more to the story than Tony was willing to let on, but he didn't push it. If that so-called gift of his was trying to tell him something, he knew it would be revealed, well, eventually, at the right time. At least that's what he hoped. The way it sounded to me was that he couldn't always depend on impressions, even visions, to tell Frank the truth. No, the first time he told this story at Aunt Betty's, she asked him how it was that he came to get this assignment in the first place. And that's when Frank explained that the governor of the state was an old friend, and she'd asked him to check out the murder before the media made a circus of it. Stop the story before it got started, that was how she put it. Now, Tony had given Frank his address, and Frank promised to stop by for spaghetti around 6. By now, he'd come to realize that Tony probably didn't have anything to say that would help the case. He'd probably spin stories of a time when men were braver and women were prettier, and music made sense. Anyway, Frank decided that he'd go, and he'd listen and he'd nod, and then he'd thank Tony's wife for the meal. Then he'd get back to the business of trying to find the killer of a movie star that most of the world had pretty much forgotten. The place was a lot like he expected it to be. Musky smelling, filled with pockets of shadow. The bar, the kind that once had a polished surface with a shiny brass rail, it ran about 20 feet and then it stopped. And behind that was the dance floor, maybe 100 feet long and maybe 60 feet wide. A balcony hung over the sides with a battered upright piano on a stage that filled the entire back of the place. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust. It was the chalk outline that drew him to the center of the room, though. An outline of Audrey Hilliard's corpse, made just after she was found yesterday around dusk. Where Audrey's head used to be, there was a huge crimson stain. Frank concentrated on the outline. He hadn't yet spoken to the medical examiner, but he was pretty sure he didn't need to, that Audrey herself would tell him all he needed to know. The online news account that he'd read on the plane ride from Tucson, which is where his home office was, covered most of what the governor had already told him. The rest he knew because it was public information. Audrey Hilliard was born and raised in this tiny Kansas town, and from there the story became, well, pretty much the creation of a run-of-the-mill press agent. Pretty girl leaves home at 18 to make it big in Hollywood. Pretty girl actually stars in 15, maybe 20 movies at a time when picture shows were still entertaining. Eventually, though, film offers dried up. To her credit, Audrey had been active with UNICEF for a number of years, and when the President of the United States, who was an ardent fan, offered her a position of ambassador to Ghana, she not only accepted, she was reported to have actually dedicated herself to her new post. 3 years later, she made the decision to retire and return to her roots in the Midwest. It was actually the mayor who convinced her when he suggested that they renovate the old Liberty Ballroom. That was part of a revitalization program he was trying to kickstart. Anyway, he said it was just the boost the town needed, and he even got the Women's Council behind it.
Ladies, if this committee is to organize the kind of dinner we want for our event, we've got to make certain that every dignitary in the county, well, maybe even the state, is in attendance. The mayor has agreed to give the welcome speech, of course. We're going to need all the help we can get if this place is to be... Yes, Tony?
The city manager gave me permission to hire a few fellas who will begin restoration. I've got those names right here.
Frank tried to visualize the prettiest girl in the country dancing with Tony, but he just couldn't make the image stick, you know? Something about the guy, it wasn't ringing true, Frank said. Or he didn't get the feeling the guy was scary or dangerous, but something just wasn't right. He tried to block out the image of the Tony he just met and go back to when he was 18, here in this ballroom. Audrey at 18. That was all so long ago. The scent was heavy in the air, as if dance floor wax still lingered in the corners. He prowled around the place. He was taking in the atmosphere, you know, because he knew the answer was there. He knew it was there, just out of reach. Well, he pulled a rusted folding chair from a stack against one wall, and he held it back to the outline where he sat down. And then he leaned back, and he closed his eyes and let the music wash over him. When he opened his eyes again, he glimpsed shapes through what looked like a fine mist. And then the mist cleared, and he saw a band on the stage that was now brightly lit. And dancers, they swirled in rhythm to the music from a couple of years before Frank's time. And yet, he could smell the perfume, the sweat, the sharp tang of alcohol from the bar, and the brown odor of burning tobacco. Hundreds of people were laughing. They were laughing and dancing. They were drinking, smoking. Young people dressed for a night on the town. And Frank watched, and he listened. what was it? What was it that he was supposed to be seeing? The gift wasn't playing fair. It allowed him questions without giving him a single answer. So he concentrated on the music, he said. Had he heard it before? Did it have some kind of a special meaning? He said he hung his head, and then he shook it, trying to get a clear image. And then he looked up again. Several feet away, there were two young women, but they were hidden by the crowd. But he heard what sounded like an old-fashioned cat fight. So he got up, and he pushed through the dancers. He was hoping to get a better look. He said he knew it was important to stay cautious about believing anything he saw. He could so easily be misinterpreting the vision. It was Audrey's voice, all right. Audrey's voice he heard, but she was with another girl, and they were really going at it.
You really think he's interested in you? In your dreams, you skinny little witch.
But, oh my goodness.
You're pathetic.
Audrey, he said, was just incredible. Barely 18. She was tall and willowy and absolutely gorgeous. He said he recognized her from those old movies that he sometimes watched on cable TV. Frank said he almost felt sorry for the other girl. She was actually attractive, but of course she was no match for Audrey, and nobody in the room was. And when that other girl, finally got a few words in, her voice was low, and it was measured. And her eyes, Frank said, they were narrowed to slits.
I'll get even with you, Audrey, even if it takes the rest of my life.
Frank told me that the vision faded so fast, it was actually like somebody blowing out the flame on a match. Just poof, poof, gone. And there he was then, alone in that musky old building. And I gotta tell you, I believed him when he said he was shaken to the core. It had been so real. The music, the voices, so real. And he knew that girl's threat, that wasn't an idle one. He said that hair actually rose on the back of his neck as he folded up the chair and leaned it back against the wall where he'd found it. The spaghetti with Tony and his wife suddenly sounded pretty good. I think he needed the company of real people.
You've been listening to Murder at the Liberty Ballroom. The disco music heard in the Liberty Ballroom scene was written and performed by Johnny Boyle and made available through the courtesy of Upbeat. The rest of the score was provided by David Wesleyan Studios. Paul Kratzer portrayed Tony Ruggiero, and Sandy O'Connor played the councilwoman. Sarah Kratzer was heard as Audrey Hilliard. Osana Drake played Janet Dennison at 18. And I'm Jack Diamond, inviting you to soar on the wings of imagination.
You know, one of the things I most enjoy doing in post-production is laying in the music for our programs. And we are so very grateful to David Wesleyan and his team at Wesleyan Studios. All of them, incredible composers and performers. David Rinda, Steve Oxon, David Robson. These guys contribute their talent and their time to helping producers like me turn out the very best productions possible. And if you're a podcaster, check out Wesleyan Studios and their fabulous music library. It's free and it's unbelievably professional. Sound effects in this production, they came from Free Sound, and we can't say enough good about them either. So thank you, David Wesleyan, and thank you, Free Sound. Well, that was part 1. That's Dennis Merle's story about Frank Patel. So how about next Sunday? The same time, same place, right here at this dinner table, when we'll have another cup of coffee, another piece of pie, and I'll tell you part 2.